You're listening to Autumn on the Air, the weekly podcast that brings you conversations about the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Join us for interviews with patent and licensing professionals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and tech transfer leaders on the issues and trends that matter most. Keep listening for an inside track on the people, IP policies, and politics changing our world.
Welcome to Autumn on the Air. Today we're exploring a topic that could fundamentally alter how we approach patent portfolios and IP strategy. Joining us is Erin Daly, a patent attorney with an exceptional combination of scientific expertise and legal acumen. Erin is the founder of Daly Law Strategy, where she specializes in intellectual property strategy and portfolio management for life sciences companies. She holds a Ph.D. in organic chemistry from the University of Notre Dame and a J.D. from Suffolk University Law School, and is licensed to practice before the USPTO. Erin's career spans over a decade in patent law, including roles as Director of Intellectual Property at Arvinas, a clinical stage biotechnology company, and as Senior Manager of Intellectual Property at the University of Connecticut. Erin has extensive experience with preclinical and clinical programs across pharmaceuticals, biopharmaceuticals, chemical processes, and drug delivery systems, making her uniquely qualified to discuss how the proposed patent tax changes could impact the innovation ecosystem. Welcome to the podcast, Erin. So excited to have you here on the air.
I'm excited to be here, Lisa.
Well, thanks for joining. And we have a very interesting and controversial topic to talk about today. And this is the value-based patent tax that's been proposed by the Trump administration. Can you talk to us a little bit about what this tax is and how it differs from traditional USPTO fee structure?
Yeah, so what's essentially being discussed is a shift from a flat fee system to a value-based system. Right now, if you own a U.S. patent, you pay maintenance fees at 3 set intervals, 3.5, 7.5, and 11.5 years after the patent issues. And those payments are the same regardless of how successful or unsuccessful your invention is. They're user fees designed to help the patent office recover its operating costs. The proposal on the table is a completely different animal. Instead of those flat fees, or perhaps on top of them, patent owners would pay an annual charge based on the assessed value of each patent. Think of it like a property tax, but applied to your intellectual property. So if you hold a patent on a blockbuster drug, you could owe 1 to 5% of the patent's estimated economic value every year. For small, low-value patents, the cost might be minor, but for valuable ones, the bill could be massive. That's a fundamental shift in how we think about the cost of owning a patent in the U.S.
Absolutely. And talk to us a little bit why this is such a significant departure from how we traditionally here in the U.S. have treated patents.
The U.S. system has always treated patents more like a service than a revenue source. When you pay fees, you're essentially paying to keep your rights alive and to support the patent office's operations. Those fees were never intended to reflect the market value of your invention. And what's being proposed would change that philosophy. Suddenly, patents would become something you're taxed on, like real estate or personal property. And that makes patents not just a right you secure, but also a potential liability you have to budget for every year. It's a change in how we are positioned in the U.S. economy, and it aligns more with a revenue raising model than a service funding model.
Yeah, and as far as I'm aware, there isn't any other system in the world that has such a value-added tax.
Yes, the U.S. would be an outlier.
Yeah. So how far along is this proposal, and are there particular next steps you think we should be watching for in terms of possible implementation?
So right now, we're still in the idea stage. There's no published rule, no bill in Congress, and nothing in the Federal Register. What What we do have are reports that the Commerce Department and the USPTO leaders are actively discussing the concept. If it moves forward, there are two main routes. One would be a notice of proposed rulemaking from the USPTO, although that would likely trigger challenges about whether the office even has the authority to do this, since its mandate is cost recovery, not taxation. The other and probably more realistic path would be legislation in Congress that explicitly authorizes a value-based tax, possibly enforced by the IRS.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of opposition if it were to go that latter route. And I agree with you on the former route. I think that's probably unlikely, although it'll be interesting now that we officially have our commissioner to see if this chatter starts to pick up now or not.
Yes, definitely. As we have a new USPTO director, it would be interesting to see how much momentum this gains.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about valuation in a little bit more detail, because there may be some listeners who are not that familiar with it. Tell us what makes patent valuation so complex, and why might this lead to controversy or perhaps even litigation?
So valuing a patent is not very straightforward. Unlike a house or a car, most patents don't have a clear market price. The value can depend on dozens of factors, like how broad the claims are, whether competitors can design around them, how strong the legal enforceability is, whether the technology is being adopted quickly or slowly, and whether the patent sits alone or inside a much larger portfolio. Most patents are never sold or licensed, so you don't have comparable sales to look at. And even when patents are licensed, the terms are often confidential. That means the government would have to rely on valuation models, and valuation models are subjective. Two different experts could look at the same patent and come up with wildly different numbers, and that's a recipe for disputes. And when the stakes are in the millions of dollars in tax liability, that's when you can expect litigation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think what you're saying is there's really no industry-wide standards and probably best practices for valuing patents. So I'm thinking there are going to have to be some new methodologies that are going to have to be created.
So there are some existing methods. The three big ones are income-based, where you look at expected future revenue, market-based, where you try to find comparable deals, and cost-based, where you look at what it took to develop the invention. But none of these are universally accepted for every situation, and all of them have flaws. At the scale of a national tax system, those shortcomings really matter. Agencies would probably lean on these existing frameworks, but then they'd have to write new rules, as you suggested, to deal with the edge cases. Like, how do you value a patent that covers an emerging technology with no market yet? Or how do you handle a portfolio where 20 patents all relate to one product? Do you divide the value equally, or do you give more weight to the foundational one? And those questions don't have clear answers today. And that would be breaking new ground.
Absolutely. And I'm assuming there would be a lot of constitutional or legal issues that are probably going to arise if, in fact, this tax were to become law.
Yeah, so there are a few layers here. There's statutory authority. As I alluded to earlier, the Patent Office currently has statutory authority to set fees to cover its costs, but not to raise revenue. So unless Congress acts, a value-based tax might be challenged as exceeding the USPTO's powers. There's also due process and delegation. If Congress were to authorize the tax, but left the details up to the USPTO or IRS without clear guardrails, you could see non-delegation challenges or claims that the process doesn't give patent owners enough notice or opportunity to contest valuations. And the third, it has been suggested that if the tax is too high, it could be attacked as a taking or an excessive fine. And those claims might be less likely to proceed, but they show how many constitutional angles could be in play here.
Yeah, this would probably be in litigation for a while, is the way I'm kind of seeing this. And, I think there are other issues here as well. What if this moves from the USPTO administration to IRS enforcement? How does compliance, or how might compliance and reporting processes change for patent holders?
So it would feel much more, it would feel much more like paying an income or property tax than paying a USPTO fee. Instead of just cutting a check every few years, patent owners would have to likely file annual returns, provide documentation to back up their valuations, and be prepared for audits. Obviously, as everyone's familiar with, the USPTO or the IRS has an established process, deficiency notices, penalties, appeal to the tax court that are far more formal and adversarial than what patent owners are used to. So compliance would require not just paying a bill, but building a defensible valuation process, keeping records, and budgeting for the possibility of a dispute with the government.
The levels of paperwork and the complexity just would be I would think, tremendous for patent holders.
I mean, no one really loves tax time.
No one does. None of us like our personal taxes or our business taxes, let alone, the layers of complexity as you've outlined here. It seems like it would be a huge undertaking. So you mentioned blockbuster drugs before, and I'm thinking for pharmaceutical and biotech companies with these types of patents, they're pretty significant risks and consequences of this tax.
Yeah. This is probably the most exposed sector. If you think about a single patent on $1 billion drugs under a value-based system, that one asset could trigger a tax bill of hundreds of millions of dollars each year. And that fundamentally changes the economics of drug development, which already requires enormous upfront investment. Companies might respond by pruning their portfolios, moving patent ownership to foreign subsidiaries, or fighting valuations tooth and nail in court. It could also shift how they enforce patents, maybe becoming more selective or more aggressive, depending on the circumstances. Either way, it would put biotech and pharma squarely at the center of the policy debate.
Yeah, absolutely. Besides biotech and pharma, I wanted to ask you about some highly innovative sectors like semiconductors and AI. How do you think they're going to be affected if this were to pass, and in terms of not only the tax, but also the burden of having to do this patent valuation?
So these industries live and breathe on massive portfolios. They can range in the thousands of patents that work together to protect products. Valuing each one every year would be incredibly burdensome. Just building the internal systems to track and document those valuations could rival the cost of maintaining the patents today. And because many patents overlap, it's not clear how you would divide the value. If 5 patents all cover one chip design, do you give each 20% of the value, or do you treat some as more critical than others? That ambiguity means companies could face inconsistent reporting and higher risk of audits. For fast-moving areas like AI, where the market shifts quickly, the numbers could also swing year to year, creating unpredictability.
And what about sectors like renewable energy or green tech innovation? What does this mean for them?
So green tech companies often need patents to attract investors, but they don't necessarily see a return for years. If they're forced to pay value-based taxes before commercialization, they may abandon patents or decide not to file them at all. That could spook investors and slow down the very kind of innovation, clean energy, carbon capture, sustainable materials that policymakers are trying to encourage. In other words, the tax could end up working at cross purposes with climate and energy policy.
Yeah, it's really pretty scary. It really is.
Definitely.
Definitely. And what about, startups and university spinouts? I would think it would be pretty much the same things, where we're talking about early stage pre-revenue patents.
Yeah. So Startups, spinouts often have patents that look very valuable on paper. For example, they're covering a promising new platform technology, but they often don't generate revenue immediately, if at all. So if those are taxed on a projected future value, the companies may owe money that they simply don't have. And that creates a cash flow strain that could force them to abandon patents prematurely. And for universities, tech transfer offices could suddenly find themselves holding patents on early stage research with no licensing deals yet, but with no significant tax bills attached. And that could undermine the basic model of moving ideas from academia into the private sector.
Yeah, absolutely. As they're trying to find a licensee, they're getting hit with a tax bill. It's not a good scenario at all for tech transfer offices. So, Erin, I wanted to ask you, given this, and, we don't know what's going to happen with this proposal, as we've been talking about, it's just a proposal, and there's a lot of steps that are going to have to happen before it becomes a law. But let's talk about, maybe what people can do at universities, tech transfer offices, in terms of formulating a strategic response. Are there some concrete steps you think that tech transfer offices and companies should be doing now to assess which patents in their portfolio might attract higher valuations?
I think that at the early stages, companies should be mapping their portfolios to revenue, which patents are tied to flagship products, which ones generate licensing incomes, those that would likely draw higher valuations. And it's also smart to run scenarios. What would one look like with a 1% tax? What about 5%? And it helps frame the risk exposure. Companies should also flag which patents are more defensive or incremental, because those may carry less risk, and they should start documenting their valuation assumptions. So if this does move forward, they have a defensible paper trail ready for audits.
Yeah, that's a really great suggestion. And, I'm starting to think here there might be situations for companies in particular to maybe decide to protect an innovation as a trade secret rather than filing a patent.
Yeah. I think trade secrets could become a more attractive option in certain situations if you have a process that's hard to reverse engineer. For example, a manufacturing method. Keeping it a secret avoids both public disclosure and any tax liability. And the same goes for incremental improvements that don't add a lot of licensing value, or early stage platforms where commercialization is years away. But there's also a trade-off. Trade secrets don't stop someone who independently invents something. So companies will have to weigh the benefit of avoiding the tax against the risk of losing enforceability.
Yeah, that's the downside, unfortunately, to trade secrets. So yeah, it's a tough question. It depends on so many factors, as you well know. Can you talk a little bit about how maybe corporate structuring or portfolio reorganization might help maybe mitigate exposure to this tax?
Yeah, so we might see companies set up separate IP holding entities, sometimes in more favorable jurisdictions, or others may reorganize the business line, assign patents to subsidiaries that line up with product revenue, which can make valuations more rational. I think portfolio pruning will also be a part of the strategy, letting go of patents that don't justify their cost under the new system. And some companies may restructure their licensing deals to spread value across multiple patents, lowering the exposure attached to any single asset.
So, Erin, do you think companies might shift their filing strategies towards other countries, meaning other than the US, if this tax really does become an issue here?
I think that's likely, since the US would be an outlier. No other major jurisdiction, if any jurisdiction, has a value-based patent tax. Companies may decide to file fewer US patents or to delay US filings while relying more heavily on PCT, Europe, Japan, China, for core inventions. Most companies will probably eventually still need US protection because it's the biggest market. But for marginal filings, we could see a rebalancing away from the US.
Yeah, I could really see that, especially for some of these blockbuster patents where this tax could be hundreds of millions of dollars like you spoke about. So, Erin, looking ahead a little bit, what do you think listeners should watch in terms of the legislative and regulatory landscape in the ensuing months here?
I think first watch Congress. If you see a bill that gives the IRS authority to enforce this, that's a major development. Second, watch the Federal Register and the OIRA's Unified Agenda. Those are places where new rules get posted. Watch for coalition letters and hearings, especially in the Judiciary Committee and Ways and Means. And I suppose there's always the possibility of an executive order. Who knows? But I think those are all early signs that this proposal is moving away from concept to reality.
Yeah. Oh, and you're right about an executive order. Given how many have been signed since the beginning of the year, that's always a possibility to watch out for. How do you think any forthcoming IRS or PTO guidance on valuation will affect the practical impact of this tax?
So I think guidance is everything. The agencies will have to say which valuation methods are acceptable, how to handle portfolios, and how to handle early stage patents. They'll also have to decide whether to offer safe harbors for small entities or caps on liability. If the guidance is flexible, the impact could be manageable. If it's rigid, the burden could be crushing, especially for startups and SMEs.
Now, you mentioned coalition and advocacy groups, and I want to go back to that for a second. Are you aware of any groups or coalitions that are mobilizing around the issue? And how do you think patent stakeholders can get involved?
So I know there's coalitions forming in certain sectors. I haven't heard specific names of them, but definitely I would look out for those forming at meetings in the biotech, semiconductor, software, and at universities. And they're submitting letters urging the government to back away from the idea. Companies can get involved by joining them and signing on to commitment letters and sharing case studies about how value-based tax would affect jobs and innovation. I would also check the Bar Association as an attorney. There's always committees writing letters, and the most persuasive voices are often those that can put real numbers and stories on the table.
Yeah, and I think for biotech and pharma, I'm sure bio will be heavily involved if it gets to that point, and I'm sure IPO as well.
Oh, absolutely.
So, Erin, what kind of early disputes or legal actions do you think might set the tone for how aggressively that this tax might be enforced if, in fact, it does come to fruition?
I think the first wave of cases will set the tone. You'll likely see challenges arguing the USPTO doesn't have authority to impose a tax of this kind. You're likely also to see valuation disputes, especially in high-value industries like pharma and AI, where billions of dollars could rise on an appraisal. And there also will likely be constitutional claims around due process or delegation. If the IRS is in charge, the very first audits will be critical. And I'm hoping they'd take a light touch approach. Compliance may settle into a routine. If it goes hard on penalties and strict valuations, we could see years of litigation and a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, this is a really kind of troubling proposal. And I guess right now we're just going to have to keep our eyes closely on it and see how it develops, especially with the new commissioner. But Erin, thank you so much for spending time today with us and sharing your expertise on this topic. We'll be interested to see where this goes.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for inviting me.
Thank you, Erin, for sharing your insights on this critical issue. This proposed patent tax represents more than just a fiscal policy change. As Erin noted, it signals a fundamental shift in how the U.S. treats intellectual property. Whether or not this specific proposal advances, the trend is clear. The cost of maintaining patents is under increasing scrutiny. For our listeners in tech transfer, university licensing, and IP management, now is the time to evaluate portfolios, assess exposure, and build flexibility into your strategies. Preparation today can mean resilience tomorrow. That's all for today's episode of Autumn on the Air. We'll be back next week with more conversations about the people and issues shaping research commercialization. Until then, keep innovating, and remember, the next breakthrough could be just around the corner.
Thanks for listening to Autumn on the Air with Lisa Mueller. Get social with us and share your thoughts. You can tweet us at AUTM or visit us online at autm.net. We'll be back next week on the air. Be sure to join us.